Warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good evening, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our stream about the Hamas legal case, day one. Unfortunately, we've had some technical problems in the studio, so we've had to resort to an Insta Live, which will be a bit shorter than we anticipated. But we hope that will be help to be informative and help others understand as to what's actually happened today. So it's me and my colleague Frank McGuinness from Garden Court Chambers, one of the barristers instructed by our client Hamas in this application, talking to you guys and talking through what actually occurred today. So we're going to do a few things in this short stream. We're going to talk about what actually happened with the Home Office this morning, looking a bit more detail at the grounds that Hamas are bringing the application upon. What's the wider context, wider legal context in which this application is being brought, looking at the reaction from the members of the public and the politicians in relation to the application, and finally, is there anything that you people at home can actually do to support the application? And this, again, it's very worth remembering that it remains a criminal offence to support a prescribed group like Hamas. It is not a criminal offence to support the application as long as that does not extend to supporting the organisation itself. So, Frank, talk us through what happened this morning.
Of course, Fahad, it's great to be having this conversation with you. As always, great to be working with you. Today was a resounding success, I think. We crucially submitted the application, which has been, as you know, the product of a lot of work by multiple different people who've put real time and effort and thought into making the documents that we submitted today. And today we submitted them. So they are in the possession of the Home Secretary. The ball's now in her court, and she has to consider the arguments that we've made. And then, of course, after submitting the application, to which she now has, of course, 90 days to respond, we also attended a press conference. There were a lot of very sympathetic journalists there. I think we got a very fair hearing. There was space for us to discuss for the first time publicly the application, what it's about, what the reasoning underlying it. And then, of course, the media started to pick up on what's clearly an important application, clearly an important story, and it seems to have spread far and wide. There's been media reaction around the world. Certainly, there was a lot of discussion in some of the outlets in the United States. There's been discussion in the so-called Israeli media, the Jerusalem Post. So broadly, the agenda today was to submit the application and then talk publicly about what we've been working on, and it went off without a hitch, as far as I can tell. How do you feel about it? You agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's been actually surprising, the coverage, even from places which you wouldn't expect it. It's been very neutral, if not positive. And I think there's a certain fear factor that's always been there. Can we actually talk about this application? Can we talk about the politics of prescription? And what we learned today is yes, you can.
Absolutely.
Yes, you can. And the mainstream media in Israel, in this country, in the United States, they are covering the application. They're quoting from the grounds, they're quoting from our press release, the executive summary. So that sort of fear factor that used to be there, I think that's dissipating as people are realising there's actually nothing wrong here. They are talking about a legal application.
Absolutely.
And not extending it to supporting the actual organisation.
I think the fear is, of course, an intended effect of the Terrorism Act 2000. Clearly, the Act creates a lot of offences, and people are afraid of committing offences. But what I think we've helped people to understand today, and what we continue to try to help people to understand, because it's a really important public discussion, right? People need to be able to discuss, what should be people's attitude, what should be the attitude of the British government towards the organisations that find themselves on the list of prescribed organisations. That's true for a number of different conflicts, right? It's certainly true for the north of Ireland, where I come from. There were difficult discussions about what do you do with, I mentioned this, of course, at the press conference, right? What do you do with a figure like Bobby Sands, who is clearly a member of a prescribed organisation, right? It's a crime to be a member of a prescribed organisation, and yet he won an election. And so the entire scheme of the Terrorism Act 2000 will create this chilling effect. That's clearly its intended effect. But what we have done today, is to submit an application that allows space to talk about the merits of the application, while we, of course, continue to reiterate that the Act remains fully in force and its application continues to apply to Hamas. And so I think the formulation, so to speak, that I've come up with that has helped people who come to me and said, look, I want to talk about what's happening here. I spoke to journalists about it, I spoke to colleagues about it. The formulation I've come up with, I think is quite helpful, is to say, look, it's possible to support an application without supporting the organisation that makes it. And that's how you sort of make sure that you create the space for yourself to say, look, I do respect the law in Britain. I understand that there are criminal offences in respect of certain things you could say or do in respect of Hamas. But that doesn't extend to expressing your support for an application, so long as you make clear that you're not crossing any of the red lines that are created by the Terrorism Act.
I think that's quite important because one of the grounds that's argued, and we'll get to the grounds now, but one of the grounds we argue is that it impinges upon freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, because it is a time to have nuanced, difficult conversations. And as we did in Ireland, as happened in South Africa, you can't get to the end game of a lasting political settlement without having that conversation.
Absolutely. Well, do you think it would be useful for people then? Because one of the things I think some of the feedback that people have been sending our way is that it's obviously a complex legal document. The submissions themselves run to almost 100 pages, and then they're accompanied by 20 expert reports. It's hundreds of pages of legal submissions and evidence. And I think sometimes as lawyers we forget how much jargon we wade through every day in our job. And we just get used to it. The European Convention, ECHR, Human Rights Act, it just rolls off the tongue because that's our profession, right? And if we found ourselves in a hospital, we would struggle with the medical terminology because it's not our profession. So would it be useful for you to sort of translate into language that ordinary people can understand, the contents, the grounds themselves, so that people who are trying to follow along what's happening can better understand exactly the sorts of arguments that we're making in the application?
Yeah, absolutely. With the caveat that we're not extraordinary, but we're just lawyers, we're professionals in that field. The grounds essentially are three. I mean, that's what we've argued. And the first one is based on international law, the right to defend yourself, the right to resistance against occupation, against apartheid, against genocide. I don't think anyone disputes that. Palestinians have the right to resist this type of these crimes. Like any other occupied people have the right to do so. So we're saying that the prescription effectively denies them that right. The second argument is the freedom of speech one, that you can't have this conversation. We're seeing that now, that even that we can talk about the application, people are still afraid, can we talk about this? And we're saying, yes, you can. Because you might not like Hamas, you might loathe the Hamas, you might not agree with anything they say, but you might think that, look, it's still worth talking, whether it's possible that you can have a conversation with them. As you said today at the press conference, Mandela was despised. He was declared a terrorist. He was just told, we can't have any conversation with this person. And now he's lauded as the most heroic freedom fighter today.
And I know you're going to come to the third ground, but just dwelling on that for a moment. I mean, it's obviously controversial and it splits opinion where I come from, right? In the north of Ireland, it's a very divisive issue, this question of the Irish struggle for United Ireland versus the unionist position, right? Unionists who prefer to preserve the so-called union with the United Kingdom. And I mean, people have very, very strong feelings about the IRA, right? A lot of people are very, very justifiably angry with some of the things that were said and done in the name of Irish republicanism. Civilians were killed, atrocities were committed, and the more thoughtful Irish Republicans have freely admitted that, right? And the point is that, so just as people can have extremely strong, hostile, critical views of the IRA, and they can nevertheless recognise that what we have now in the north of Ireland is a durable peace, and that peace would not have been possible without having conversations with explicitly prescribed organisations and people like Bobby Sands who started winning elections. And once members of prescribed organisations start winning elections, it's very difficult to see how any peaceful solution is going to be reached without talking to them. But you were going to come on to...
Well, that brings us right to the third ground. The third ground is, while the Home Secretary, someone has to be involved in terrorism in order to be prescribed. Not every organisation that's involved in terrorism is prescribed. Because terrorism is very broad. It's any sort of political violence anywhere in the world. So what the application seeks to say is that terrorism could apply to the Israeli occupation forces, could apply to the British Armed Forces, the Ukrainian army, and a whole variety of groups around the world who are not actually banned. So the question then goes back to is, why is Hamas banned? And is that ban can that be maintained in the current climate? And we have to look at the factors. So the Secretary said has a discretion, the Home Secretary, she has to look at certain factors. Does it pose a specific threat to the United Kingdom? Does it pose a specific threat to British nationals overseas? Does it have a presence in the United Kingdom? Will it be working in alliance with your partners in the war on terror? In addition to that, we've argued that Hamas won democratic elections. They should not be banned for that reason because they are the elected government. As such, there's a civil administration and they control everything in the territory. Whether you like it or not, they are the civil administration. So they will control the hospitals, the schools, the street cleaners, the garbage collections, anything and everything related to the civil administration is under the control of Hamas. And what you're effectively doing then by prescribing the group, you're saying that anybody who has any relation with any of these civil institutions is effectively a terrorist. And that's the language that the Israelis use when they target these places. They use it as an excuse to attack hospitals, to execute aid workers, to attack Iran, because the theory is, well, these are all Hamas. So what we're saying is this has to be looked at, the fact that you cannot even get humanitarian aid into Gaza at the moment because there's a possibility it might go to someone linked to Hamas. And this is a real problem. So what we're saying is that if you consider all these factors in the round, the correct decision is to deprescribe Hamas. Absolutely. So those are the grounds. I hope that's able to break it down in more simple terms for everybody, because it is, as you said, it's quite technical points.
All right, so perhaps I should explore, because one of the things I talked about this morning at the press conference was the wider context. And I do think it's important, obviously, the application is happening in a wider legal context. And I think most people who follow the atrocious things that we're still witnessing coming out of Gaza have become very, very familiar with the legal context. Because in some ways, the serious limitations of international law notwithstanding, there have been some helpful developments in that area. And so, I suppose when I've been asked about it, when I've tried to talk about it, why is this application happening now? That's a question I kept getting asked. What's the context? What accounts for the timing of this application? I think my sort of concise answer is that we need to admit that the emperor has no clothes, that Zionism is a dying ideology, that it's in a terminal crisis, and that just like South African apartheid, Israel apartheid seems to be on its last legs. We're witnessing the collapse of an apartheid regime. And it seems as though there's been a reticence to state that very obvious fact, hence the emperor's new clothes metaphor, right? It's like everyone has to sort of pretend that Israel is this functional democracy that's wearing clothes, when actually we can see that it's engaged in the most naked racial domination and genocide. Like this is not ambiguous anymore. It's completely, the emperor has no clothes whatsoever. And so the application cannot be understood without understanding the extraordinary context which has led our client Hamas to take this step. That context includes, of course, the ICJ. In some ways, that's the high watermark of this stuff. The ICJ, back in 2004, declared that the occupation was illegal under international law. That means that for more than half a century, Palestine's been illegally occupied. More recently, the ICJ, of course, in January of last year, in response to South Africa's case, has handed down interim measures because it's plausible that Israel is breaching the Genocide Convention. Like that's a staggering sentence to have to say, and we mustn't become numb to what that means. We are living through a genocide right now. It's been going on for a year and a half, for 18 months. That forms part of the context, and that's not some radical fringe making that assertion. That's the ICJ saying this is plausible. That's South Africa, EU states like Ireland, Spain, Belgium saying this is genocide. This is murdering people because of their race, because they're viewed as a demographic threat to the racial purity of Israel's apartheid state. So that forms part of the context. In July of last year, the ICJ, in a different case, handed down its advisory opinion, and that has confirmed that as a settled matter of international law, Israel is committing apartheid in breach of Article 3 of the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. It's committing racial segregation, and so there's no basis for doubting it. Again, when we say apartheid regime, this is not some nasty, malicious branding exercise. This is international law. This is the settled position. So that's the ICJ, and then you have the ICC. It's difficult to overstate this. It's staggering.
And what would you say to some critics might say, well, all of these institutions are anti-Semitic because they're attacking the world's only Jewish state. And this has been the criticism by many Zionists have laid upon people who've said use these terms apartheid, that how come you want to go after Israel?
Absolutely. So let me just finish the ICC point and then I'll respond to that immediately. The crucial point about the ICC is that Netanyahu is a fugitive. That's not some radical rhetoric or whatever. That's simply the position is that there is an arrest warrant out for that man, and the law in the UK says that if he sets foot here, he's to be arrested. And so he cannot attend the territory of some of his closest allies because they will arrest him. Right? again, the emperor has no clothes. This is an obvious fact that for some reason we tiptoe around. But what's clear is that when you add up all of these legal propositions, and then of course there was a story on Monday of this week that 10 British people stand accused of committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, and there's reason to believe that the Metropolitan Police is going to have to take seriously individual criminal prosecutions, right? So all of that creates this clear context that Israel is in a terminal crisis. Its official ideology of Zionism is completely toxic, and its own allies are having to recognise that fact and distance themselves from it. And that is the wider context of the application. And to your point about anti-Semitism, then, yes, of course, it's the case that we need to think about what's actually happened with Israeli apartheid, right? Israel has self-racialized, calls itself the Jewish state, illegitimately claims a mandate, tries to act on behalf of all Jews around the world, passes laws to that effect, like the Basic Law 1950, which says every Jew may return to Israel as an Ole, right? Every Jew claims to speak on behalf and give rights to every Jew in their capacity as Jews, right? So this self-racialization process, and then when people say entirely legitimate, thoughtful is these things, Palestinians like subhuman, the rhetoric of your senior officials is explicitly genocidal, Israel is able to avail itself of this illegitimate shield against to say, oh, you're attacking us because we're Jewish, even though we only know that Israel is the Jewish state because they tell us that that's what it is. So they constitute themselves as an apartheid state, saying we're a Jewish state, we take the mandate to speak for Jews. And then people say, right, well, that's interesting, that's what you tell yourself, but we do not do this genocide. They again say, that's raised there. And if you think about the parallel with South African apartheid, I would say, well, just think about this sense. I would say South Africa under its apartheid regime is a horrific affront to human dignity. Like it needs to be dismantled urgently. It engaged in racial domination of Black Africans because it used them as a threat. It used them as a demographic threat because of their race. That is disgustingly racist, and we should dismantle it urgently. We owe it to Black Africans, but we owe it to ourselves as humans to dismantle this staggering affront to our common humanity. If I said that sentence, Margaret Thatcher and the people who did support South African apartheid might disagree with you, but they wouldn't say you were being racist against Africans. They would just sound silly if they did that. And yet, if you change all the proper nouns, the sentence that I just said, by exactly the same reasoning and say, Israeli apartheid is a staggering affront to Palestinian dignity, got to our common humanity. We need to dismantle this. And this is what we do. We know from the South African example, from other examples of racial segregation, that this is how we respond as humans to this affront. Then I'll be met almost certainly by some courses, in some courses, with a malicious allegation of anti-Semitism that's based on a definition, like the arbitrary definition, right? Completely, deliberately dysfunctional definition that operates more than the shelter is. What is the arbitrary definition? It's the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition. It was drafted by a guy who subsequently raised serious objections to the way that it's being used. It's the protesting anti-Zionist speech. Broadly, it's, to put it bluntly, it's a broken definition that should be ironed. It is not fit for prime time. A number of extremely senior people, including Jeffrey Robson Casey, have written opinions saying you simply cannot use this as a punitive standard. And yet, very senior, mostly allies of Israel and Zionist organizations that are sympathetic to Israel, deliberately use it because they know that it's the problem is, problematic. What is the problem with it? The problem with it is, firstly, that the definition itself is hopelessly vague. It's not actually a useful way of combating anti-Semitism. It fails to capture the kind of speech that our anti-Semitic can. It captures anti-Zionist speech that is in no way anti-Semitic. And then what specifically and particularly problematic is the examples that accompany the definition. And those examples are some of them completely broken. The most notorious example is the definition suggests that accusing Israel of being a racist and anti-Semitic. That's nonsense. Like Israel was founded on the mass ethnic identity of Palestinians because they were viewed as a democrat. That's obviously racist. Genocide, fast forward to today, genocide is obviously racist. Now, some people may disagree. Clearly, you would have to say this entire endeavor is premised upon dehumanizing Palestinians. It's not racist. To point that out, it's not racist to say it's not racist endeavor. Of course it's not. And there are other examples we could touch on. So it's like Priti Patel.
who we're going to get to because she is the Home Secretary, the previous Home Secretary who actually brought law.
Absolutely, that's exactly the moment. Actually, you talked to us about the perception of the application process.
Yeah, because she's the one who actually used anti-Semitism as a base to bring the script again. Doesn't make sense because you can't ban an organization from anti-Semitism. Have to be more competitive. But yeah, how this has landed today? I mean, it's quite big. The phone's been hopping. We've been looking at social media, looking at how it's being covered in the media, and it's been quite positive. I think the public debate, and that's really good. Because remember, we're not saying you need to support Hamas. In fact, we're saying that will affect support Hamas. But what we're saying is have a discussion. Okay, let's have a debate whether this is a right and correct decision or an incorrect decision, like you would with any other matter. Because it's not some abstract concept we're debating. The lives of thousands, if not millions of people is at stake. We are watching tuning in every day on our TV screen. Now, you're telling me we can't have a debate to see how it's the best way to bring that to an end.
Right. So you're saying a lot of ordinary people are like, they do want to talk about this. They feel like the different other terrorist tactics preventing them from doing so, and they feel this urgent need to try to speak out, and the current restriction is preventing that. But that's the reaction on the street. What do you think?
Just to be balanced, a lot of people are saying, this is ridiculous. How can you ban the day they carry out terrorist attacks, or this or that? Which is fine. Again, let's have a discussion. You have that opinion. I have a different opinion, but let's have a discussion. I think I can be convinced by what you say. You can be convinced by what I say. Let's have that dialogue. And what this prescription does, not just with Hamas, but everything, it stops that dialogue. It stops the discussion.
And what about in the more, when you say establishment quarters, among MPs, the mainstream press, what's the reception been there?
So a lot of the MPs, don't know how to react to it. They haven't said anything. The ones that have come out are basically the previous Home Secretary who brought in the ban. He and his name, Generic has come out with a comment attacking the application, and also at the end having a dig at immigration lawyers and immigration. I mean, that just betrays the whole politics, right? Then you have to add that into the actual conversation, but that's what he does. He always, opportunities to attack immigrants and immigration generally, usually. But Pretty Gunn's interesting character because she's come out, she said, this group is an Iranian terrorist group, they carry out property, it should remain banned, this application, there's some of the other things I read, if you don't know the application, it should make you laugh, make you cry. The point is, don't engage with what we're saying. It is very, very interesting. And Patel is interesting because Priti Patel, I believe, went against the grain of British politics and British policy at the time she banned Hamas. Because I'm going to give it a note.
Let's say we've done a stop.
Oh, I'm really sorry. We're not being censored by anyone when we're talking pretty Patel. I'm going to give it a note saying we're having some sound issues. We're going to come back in this platform. So sorry about that.